Anybody who played Standard during Ixalan rotation will remember one card. Settle the Wreckage. This single card completely blew out overextending players constantly in that Standard environment. If your opponent held up 4 mana with at least 2 white, you'd have to carefully attack or risk losing your entire board. And if you only attacked with 1 or 2 creatures, that could either give your opponent time to draw into stabilization, or they could just use cheap removal to get rid of your single attacker. And you could just attack with 1 creature and try and bait out the Settle the Wreckage, but at that point, it's just a white Vraska's Contempt. And Vraska's Contempt saw a ton of play in that Standard. You can tell who played during that Standard environment by leaving up just 4 mana with 2 of it being white. And it's a great way to bluff somebody into not attacking if they suffer from post-settle stress disorder. It's a really effective scare tactic. A great example of how to do it right is when I used to play one of my friends in Canadian Highlander. Gruul Monsters was his deck of choice, and it felt like whenever I ran a deck with board wipes, I was never able to get him with them. I'd wipe his board, then he'd drop 2 more threats the next turn. Thinking back on those games, the reason I was never able to get him with board wipes is because I wasn't putting enough pressure on him with 1-for-1 trades with my removal. And if I'm not going to use my removal to deal with his threats currently on the board, why would he play the additional threats in his hand? Any threat can kill your opponent eventually. And since I was showing no way of stopping the pressure on the board, why would he apply more and speed the clock up by like a turn? His ability to just not overextend came so naturally to him. It was something that took me a lot of time to think about to realize, despite my PPTQ experience years ago. Back when PPTQs still existed, I used to go to them for fun. I like to call it my tournament grinder days, but it was pretty far from that. At this one PPTQ, it was round 4, if I recall correctly, game 3. My opponent was on Hardened Scales Affinity, and I was on Bogles. I looked at my opening 7, and threw it away. I looked at my 6. No good. I threw it away too. I flipped up my 5. Worse than my 6. Tossed. Slowly, I lifted up my 4. Unusable. I kept a mold of 3 of Wooded Foothills, Basic Forest, and Path to Exile. My opponent kept a mold to 6. Now, mentally, I was ready to concede at this point, but it was a PPTQ, so I decided to play it out. I fetched my Wooded Foothills into a Dryad Arbor to give me some sort of body to put any auras I drew onto, and getting incredibly lucky, I drew Rancor, Razorverge Thicket, and Hyena Umbra. But I'm getting pressured in the air by an Inkmoth Nexus. My opponent attacked turn after turn, never overextending. And sure, I could use the Path to Exile I have in my hand, but if I do that, he'll just eat his Inkmoth Nexus with his Arcbound Ravager. I pass the turn. My opponent then, for no discernible reason, goes all in. He animates both Inkmoth Nexuses and uses his Arcbound Ravager to eat 1 Inkmoth, a Welding Jar, and itself, putting counters onto the attacking Inkmoth Nexus. Seeing my chance, I pulled the trigger on my Path to Exile. He looks at the Path to Exile, up to me, and says, "Yeah, I figured you'd have that." He finds a Basic Forest tapped. From that point, I continue drawing auras and am able to take game 3. I've always kind of wondered what was going through his head when he decided to go all in on that turn. He wasn't really feeling much pressure from me, and if he had just kept attacking the way he had been, I would have lost the game and he would have won the match. And Bogles isn't exactly a deck known for its insane top decks. You've got a pretty good idea of the possible draws, and none of them were particularly swingy. Maybe Daybreak Hornet, but I didn't have the double white to attach it. Maybe he was just hungry and wanted the match to end. I'll never know the reason. I ended up losing my next 2 rounds and dropped the event. Bogles is a terrible deck after all. So, after being both the giver and the receiver of it, the one thing I want you to take away from this video is do not overextend. any threat will be able to kill your opponent if they can't stop it or are unable to stop it. Successfully protect Stormfront Pegasus, and it will get you a win no different than Dragon's Rage Channeler.